this framing that the US and China are locked in this kind of competitive geopolitical race for AI dominance. And the more I kind of saw this, the more it felt like it didn't gel with my experience. And the more I want to dig into it and kind of characterize this a bit more, I think the worst possible situation is a situation in which an actual race emerged between, for example, the US and China, or the US and any other country, or in fact, even like two companies in the US. I think if companies are racing towards this instead of going slowly and taking care about kind of fundamental alignment issues, that could be very concerning.
But you just came back from the US, or sorry, China, right?
Yeah, I go fairly regularly. So I was there for probably I think it was my 7th time in the last 2 years. So Beijing the week before last, Shanghai over the summer. Um, I was in Wuzhen last year on a trip to Beijing, Hong Kong as well.
Cool.
I missed one or two. There have been like 2 or 3 trips to Beijing, plus various of the other cities where AI stuff is happening.
That's very cool. Yeah, I'm trying to organize a cycling trip for April. So yeah, might need some advice on that. But we can start. So Seán is the program director of AI, Futures and Responsibility at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, and it's an absolute pleasure to be speaking to you today.
Well, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you.
Yeah, and the kind of like starting point for this conversation was your article, which is called "The Rhetoric and Reality of the AI Race," which was, I just found it like fascinating. So I guess it'd be useful if you could kind of just explain the core argument.
So the argument was basically, I've been going to China for about a decade now, and I've been watching things evolve there as I've been watching them evolve here. And it's been really notable to me how much divergence there's been between the narrative presented, particularly around AI competition, the AI race, when I visited China, versus how it's being spoken about in the West, particularly in the US. And I'd written about this a couple of years ago with some other colleagues when the AI race narrative was just starting to come to the fore, but it's only become way more intense now. This framing that the US and China are locked in this kind of competitive geopolitical race for AI dominance. And the more I kind of saw this, the more it felt like it didn't gel with my experience. And the more I want to dig into it and kind of characterize this a bit more. And it comes down to 2 things in particular. So first is, what do we mean by an AI race? One version of an AI race you could have is general competition around a technology. And you could argue that, yes, there's obviously competition between companies in the West and companies in China, and there's obviously both economic and geopolitical competition between the US and China. But that's sort of what you might consider a normal competition. They compete over AI and energy and electric vehicles and any number of things. And a race in that context is not one that can be definitively won, because, you can be at the lead in a particular aspect of it at a given time, but only then be overtaken or be behind in another area. But what I found particularly interesting is that there's another conception of a race, which is a race to artificial general intelligence, AI that can do everything that human intelligence can. And that is perceived by some technologists, including some of the big companies in the West, as representing sort of a step change in technology, where whoever gets there first ends up with a decisive advantage, not only over AI, but they can then use that AI to accelerate everything else. And part of the idea there is that once you get to a particular stage of development, your own AI helps you to accelerate your own development of AI, because AI takes over more and more of the AI research process. So instead of it being a race where, there's no particular endpoint and you can be overtaken at any point, maybe you reach a particular threshold and you have a lead that can't really be made up. And people like Dario Amodei at Anthropic have alluded to this, Ashton Brenner in his situational awareness. So the paper really does two things. It tries to differentiate these two types of races. It asks a question, you know, is there generally a race going on? And I think the answer there is, to a certain extent, yes, but the narrative around it has definitely been kind of exaggerated and overblown, and it seems to serve some. Uh, it's used to argue in the US for things that clearly benefit companies, like lighter regulation or energy system rollout and so on. But then there's a second specific claim to do with this other type of race, the race to AGI and to sort of geopolitical strategic advantage. And so the paper also then looks into, is that a race that is meaningfully ongoing where the US and China are the competitors? And I argue that based on the evidence that I've been able to find, that's not really a sensible way of characterizing what's going on. There's definitely some degree of race going on between leading companies, most of them in the US, but there doesn't seem to be much evidence that there is a sort of top-down national push to achieve AGI before the US happening in China. If anything, the way AI is framed and being prioritized is much more around benefiting the economy in a wide range of different sort of, tool AI type ways.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really interesting. So there's no evidence that China is racing, is that? Or are you saying there's no evidence that both the US or China are racing?
Well, I think the evidence that China's racing in this particular way is pretty weak. There has been some regional support for institutes like the Beijing Institute for General Artificial Intelligence, but that's, one point example, and they're not really developing frontier models yet, and they're taking a very different approach. There haven't been very big funding initiatives that seem to be focused on AGI. There was at one point a push to develop LLMs, general purpose AI, because ChatGPT was such a phenomenon, and certainly China's caught up and is close to the frontier on LLMs and reasoning models. But there doesn't seem to have been this push for anything like, a Chinese Manhattan Project. And this is quite important because the claim has been made by various people in the US context that the US should do this as a national priority. And it's been argued that the US should do this because China is doing it. And reading those kind of claims, that's what motivated me to look into, is that actually a sensible way of looking at it? A second question is whether the US is doing this. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, keep going, keep
And
going.
there, I think the US has been kind of allowing the market to do its thing, and there have definitely been companies that are pushing towards this. And it seems to me that the previous administration took the idea of AGI very seriously. With the current Trump administration, the signals are much more mixed. And in fact, most of the recent statements by people like, Saram Krishnan and David Sachs and so on seems to cast a lot of doubt around the idea that they think, near-term AGI is plausible. And it seems that they're much more thinking about AI in terms of what Narayan and Kapoor would call a normal technology, something where, the way you kind of win the competition is diffuse it out, and it kind of, has applications across, wide range of industries, a little more like the way the Chinese are thinking about it, less so the idea of artificial general intelligence and superintelligence.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I read an article, I think by Grace Shaw on Exponential View, there's EMSR um blog, which is called like China's different AI path, and she talks about like China approaching AI from the perspective of like faster open source models rather than kind of like heavier, larger kind of like source models, which I thought was quite interesting. Would you say, because another kind of data point in this to like add to this kind of question is around the China's recent strategy, the AI plus strategy. Is that like one of the things you're looking at in order to kind of like argue that China doesn't appear to be like racing from the top down towards AGF?
I think the recent AI Plus release certainly supports that argument. It's not so much a new thing in that it's sort of an update of an ongoing process, but it is kind of an evolving policy that I've looked into with a colleague, Christy Look. We uh, released a an article on it in The Wire China a couple of months ago, and she'd gone through sort of Chinese AI policy going back years, and there's been this kind of evolving strategy that's very much focused on developing AI to benefit the economy in a lot of different ways, and much less this idea of strong AI and superintelligence. And in fact, a lot of skepticism from some of the people who advise government on whether this is a near-term thing. You can also see it reflected in speeches President Xi has given, where the language hasn't changed that much over the last couple of years, and seems to be much more sort of tied to ideas of machine learning applied in innovative ways, and less so around the idea of a unified goal of something like artificial general intelligence. Various analysts have noted that it's interesting that it hasn't changed over time, where the narrative in the US has, I guess, it shifted, and maybe it's shifting back a little bit at the moment.
That is really interesting because I guess one reason, one reason potentially that this narrative has developed, I don't know if you would like agree with this, is potentially the use of kind of historical analogies. I mean, you could also argue that the narrative developed and then historical analogies were developed based on the narrative, but it appears that the historical analogies used by um the Chinese government and like the US government seem to be a little bit different in the sense of I believe in the AI Plus plan, they actually explicitly talk about, the Chinese government explicitly talk about kind of like electricity and the internet as comparators. Whereas I think in your article you mention Alex Karp. I know he's not actually part of the US government, but he's the CEO of Palantir, and he talks about like the Oppenheimer moment. And then there's other kind of like US organization talk about like potential Manhattan project. So like at least implicitly comparing it to the atom bomb. So I guess like, do you think, yeah, do you think in this narrative developing the historical analogies have actually played a kind of like um harmful part, or and do you think like that would be a way of kind of addressing it, is actually like thinking through what historical analogies are most kind of like useful?
I think this is a really interesting question, because it's a little hard for me to know what to say in terms of the directionality here. I mean, you could argue that if you think of AI as being like electricity or the internet, then it leads you to think about, well, now you have electricity or the internet. Let's, make it as easy as possible for people to innovate and figure out lots of smart, unexpected ways to use the internet or electricity to, do lots of, cool new things and set up cool new companies and so on. And that if you then think about AI as a Manhattan Project, you think a big scary thing that probably needs to be under government control, where, you develop it once and then that changes your position on the landscape, and that frames your thinking in a very different way. Another way of approaching it is maybe you have fundamental scientific beliefs around the technology, and you look at AI and you see, and your expectation is, you know, advancing machine learning, and lots and lots of different applications that need to be developed for specific contexts that requires a lot of domain knowledge and so forth. And thus, the analogy that comes to mind for you is the Internet of Electricity. Maybe you think of artificial general intelligence and you think, well, if this can really do what Demis Hassabis says, if it is something that is able to automate the kind of scientific discovery that Einstein did when he discovered general relativity, then that's very clearly not the internet. It's something that like fundamentally changes the scientific and maybe even civilizational landscape. And I have to say, I have some sympathy with the latter framing, but I imagine there's something two-way here, and it's why I think narratives like these can be useful, but it makes sense to also maintain some degree of skepticism and not allow them to constrain our thinking too much.
Interesting. Um, because yeah, it does strike me that historical analogies are used a lot when talking about AI. Like I think I recall Sundar Pichai talking about kind of like the invention of fire, when talking about like I think when he was like launching Gemini or something like that. And I think, I think I heard Demis I was talking about like the Industrial Revolution. So there's a lot of different analogies used, and yeah, I'm kind of interested in like how that shapes how people kind of like act towards like this current technology. And I guess because it's also unfolding, like it's not really clear at this stage probably what the right kind of like historical category to use is. And I suppose it's kind of like unfolding all the time. And maybe maybe there isn't like a single category that's most useful to use as well. Um, but it's really interesting because like going back to what you said previously about um some of like the narrative that was coming out about the race towards AGI, um and China from some of like people in major labs and in governments like didn't chime with your experience of China. That's really interesting. Do you think like part of the problem is like a more general, like limited understanding of China? Um, and like, do you think, because I know I think we were talking about this previously, but there is this like China Watchers community, and I think one of their, from what I can see, one of their kind of premises is that Western politicians have a bit of a blind spot when it comes to actually understanding China. Do you think like this is part of the problem?
I do think it is part of the problem, and I think it is a problem that, if anything, has become worse in recent years, in large part because we have had more of a decoupling. If you went back to 2019, you had sort of Google and IBM and so on having technology headquarters in places like Beijing as well as in the West. But over the last 6 years, you've had like a big retreat. And so there's just much less kind of interaction and exchange of ideas and sort of water cooler conversations and so on, which makes it easier, I think, to maintain different views and maintain misconception. I think there's some element of we see the technology in this way, and so we reflect our thinking onto the people we see as our adversary without necessarily recognizing the extent to which actually they see this quite differently. I think there's also a tendency to sort of see China as a monolith. And so the idea that because it's, the kind of country it is with the kind of government it is, that it just, makes a decision at the top and then the whole thing moves like the Borg or something. Whereas my experience with China is lots of people, the usual jockeying for position and the usual kind of department wants to have ownership of this because it gets it some prestige, but some other group would like to actually own this thing. And then there's kind of, interdepartmental kind of bickering over like who's responsible for this bit of AI and so on. Exactly the kind of thing that you get in the West. It's much more, I guess, like what we're used to in that sense. I will say, I have to caveat in that I go to China and I've been quite a number of times, but I will only ever see one part of China. I'll meet with the academics who are internationally minded and who are pro cooperation, and we certainly have extremely constructive conversations, but I'm sure there's huge parts of the Chinese ecosystem that I just don't see. I mean, I've had no interaction with their defense sector, for example, and I'm sure the more kind of hawkish elements of their thinking would have no reason to interact with me. So I have to acknowledge that I may have some biases in the parts of China that I see.
Fair enough. I guess that because I was just saying to you earlier that I'm thinking of going on a cycling trip to China in April. Partly just because the last time I was there was 2015, and I'm like just intrigued to see how things have changed. I find it quite difficult to. I mean, I'm not saying that I've ever really like understood China necessarily, but I think it's quite a hard. It's quite hard to like get a sense of what is going on in China really. Uh, from the outside. I mean, there are. I think like Jeffrey Ding has a good blog, kind of translating some articles about AI from Chinese into English, but yeah, it's not like I wouldn't say it's like easy to kind of understand what's going on from like where I'm sitting in the UK as a like non-native Chinese speaker. Um, I mean, do you think though that like is there a way? Can you see like clear ways in which like shared understanding could be improved? And like, do you think that would be a useful thing to do in order to kind of like diffuse these like race dynamics?
I think it would be really useful, in fact. And I think the more tensions ratchet up between, well, especially between the US and China, I mean, the elephant in the room is that this is happening, but even between like, the West more broadly, the more these tensions ratchet up, the more it becomes important that there be some dialogue and, development of common understanding. I mean, even if we another historical analogy, and you'll have to forgive me, but if we go back to ideas like the Cold War, in the tensest moments there, you had academic exchanges, you had scientists from, across these divides, sharing their perspectives and working together. And that played a really important role in maintaining kind of a shared understanding and communication. And I'm not saying that's the situation we have at the moment, but there's certainly elements of that tension that are kind of ratcheting up. And it is surprising and a little, I don't know, worrying to me that there's so little of it. There are quite a few US think tanks who write about China, but comparatively little who engage with China. And if anything, it's becoming more and more difficult to do so because, well, it's more difficult to travel. There are more and more entities who'd be valuable to engage with who are being put on the US entities list, which makes it very complicated for US participants to engage with them in, for example, track 2 dialogues. And when I take part in things like track 2 dialogues, I've been part of the IDA's dialogues, and I've been going back and forth myself for various things. You see the same faces quite a lot of the time. It's a relatively small community of us. Most of us are not doing this as our full-time job. We're, governance researchers, or we're AI researchers who happen to do some of this because we think it's important. And really, we could use a whole lot more of it, I think.
That's really interesting because it's not something that I know very much about at all, but just from looking on the internet, it seems like there's a few organizations trying to kind of work in this area and help. Like I read about kind of general purpose AI policy lab, AI Safety Connect, the Safe AI Forum, and then I've seen some kind of like news around like Concordia AI. But are those, yeah, could you say a bit more about like the track 2 dialogues and like what organizations are kind of like working on this problem?
Well, the ones you mentioned are good ones. I'd throw in there Carnegie Endowment have been doing some very good work as well. I can't remember if you mentioned the Oxford China Policy Lab. I think they've been doing good work. Concordia definitely have been very, very helpful. They've been doing this for a decade. They've produced really good reports for Western audience on what's happening in, for example, AI safety in China, and they've produced work on what's happening in the West for Chinese audiences. They've worked with leading labs like the Shanghai AI Lab on their frontier AI safety frameworks, and they've organized workshops or sessions at major conferences like the World AI Conference, bringing together both Western and Chinese experts. And I think they've done a fantastic job. And I know the people who are involved, and they are just yeah, smart young people who are doing this because they think it's a really important thing to do. Oxford China Policy Lab have been doing some good work. Caleb Blomquist and Scott Singer and their team. Carnegie Endowment have been involved in some recent events, and I think they've been doing fantastic work. And I really like the pieces they've been putting out, explaining the role that, for example, the Chinese AI Safety Network is playing, and other developments in AI safety for a Western audience. The Safe AI Forum has been running the iDays dialogues, and those have been running for a couple of years now, and they've been bringing together leading scientists from China, like Andrew Yao, from the West, like Yoshua Bengio and Stuart Russell, as well as some leading governance thinkers like Jingzhu Lan of the Schwarzman College. And they've, I think, done a really good job in developing consensus on things like red lines on risks in AI. That my understanding is that's been quite influential, both in an international context and in the Chinese context, and has shown that there's a lot of room for common ground on these issues. For my own part, I've been involved. I think the Royal Society in the UK has done a really good job on this. It's been organising joint workshops, not just on AI, but on other scientific topics. And I've taken part in a few of their, for example, joint workshops with the Chinese Academy of Sciences. I've been involved with Yi Zheng, who's a professor at the Chinese Academy of Sciences and now head of the Beijing AI Safety Institute. We've co-chaired an international governance program at the World Internet Conference, and we've just set up an international cooperation research network with under the auspices of the ANSO network. So I hope those things will also play useful roles. So there are definitely things happening, and I've been very grateful for the support we've gotten from the international community in engaging with this, because everyone's so busy these days. It's not a small thing to ask people to take time out and to, fly over to Beijing and deal with the jet lag and so on. But I do think it's really important.
Yeah, that's a really it does sound really important to me. One thing that I kind of had thought to be true because I'd read it quite a few times, but I've now wonder whether it is true, and I'd be interested to hear about your perspective on it, is whether the attitudes towards AI appear to be different in the US and China among like the general population. I know it's probably quite a hard question to answer, but the reason I say this is that I think Stanford have a survey, the AI index, like the Stanford AI index, and it appears to show that attitudes towards AI in China are a lot more positive than in the US. But I've heard this kind of critiqued. I think it was Jordan Schneider of China Talk podcasts. He was kind of critiquing the methodology and saying that possibly the respondents to the survey might be like East Coast people in like large cities and maybe don't reflect the full kind of population's views. But yeah, I was just wondering like whether that question kind of figures at all in your argument, like the overall attitude of Chinese and US populations, like does that have an impact on the overall like race dynamic?
It's an interesting question. When you say Jordan Schneider, who, by the way, is brilliant, and I highly rate his China Talk website, was his critique on East Coast cities US East Coast cities or
I was,
Chinese?
oh, Chinese.
Okay, interesting. I don't think I could comment on that in particular. I haven't looked into this index or the methodology. Intuitively, it feels to me like I wouldn't be surprised if it were true. Part of it, I think, is that the scientific technological miracle is such a big part of the Chinese cultural narrative that you know, it's really invested in science and technology, and that's allowed it to really kind of boost quality of life and its kind of place in the world. That feels like a very powerful part of the cultural narrative in China, much more so than I think in Europe, where we've um, certainly there in Europe there's much more skepticism around, well, are all these technological developments actually in our interest? Will they benefit powerful corporations versus the individual? There are different attitudes towards individual privacy and things like that. And a bit more of a precautionary approach in Europe, for better or worse. Some people would say for worse because it's commonly argued that we overregulate and are holding ourselves back. Um, in the US, I mean, I don't live in the US. I certainly read a lot of media and papers that come from the US. I mean, it certainly seems like it's not as overwhelmingly positive as it is in China. And again, concerns around environmental impact of AI, water use of AI, which personally I think is somewhat overblown, but also what this is going to do to jobs and livelihood. And I think more skepticism around sort of the tech sector and whether the tech sector is definitely acting in the sort of interests of the average person. I think there are more mixed views around that. Whether that plays into the race narrative, I couldn't say for certain, but it's not entirely implausible. If, for example, a uniformly positive narrative around the benefits of AI was achieving less purchase with policymakers and with a broader audience, then you would look for other messages. And a competitive narrative that there is a sort of a threat to kind of U.S. preeminence. The U.S. allows itself to fall behind China could be, in fact, a very compelling narrative. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. It certainly feels like I've got a paper that I'm under review at the moment where I've looked at the role that the tech sector has played in promoting the race narrative, and it's played a really, really prominent role. It's been tech investors and people in leading positions in tech companies right from 2017 and the release of the Chinese plan. And very much in this, China is poised to overtake us, and then it'll be really, really bad for the US in all sorts of ways. And it's never too far away from recommendations that will certainly boost US AI progress, but also would have positive effects for the companies and the investors who are invested in those companies, whether it's increased federal investment into fundamental AI research or lighter regulation, laxer environmental laws, access to copyright data, um, any number of different things, clearly benefit the companies as well as advancing AI progress. So it certainly seems to be a very powerful narrative from that perspective.
Yeah. I have also a kind of more abstract question, I guess, which is because you work or you have worked on a number of different areas in terms of like existential risk in your career. And I've recently been reading a book by Jonathan White, called, he's a professor at LSE, and it's called like In the Long Run, and it's about how he argues that the future is kind of um we struggle to kind of like face the future because we have both like pressures on our short-term attention from social media and the kind of like speeding up of the news cycle, but also we have like a kind of feeling that we're in some kind of like decisive point in history where we need to take action on, say, like climate change um or AI. and he describes like this creating a sense of like emergency or feeling of like emergency. And I think he's talking specifically about politics, and he talks about the recent US election, and the fact that it was described by both sides as, you know, the last chance to kind of like decisively like change the country. Um, I just thought that kind of chimed with your article in a sort of interesting way. Do you think there is a more general phenomenon in society where um a sense of kind of like emergency is being sort of, I don't know if it's being generated or kind of it's just emerging, but yeah, is that something that you think is more generally?
There's a concept in the governance literature that's very related to this called securitization, where if you can kind of turn an issue from sort of a normal policy issue into an existential kind of issue, a giant threat to, your nation's sovereignty or survival or, something like that, then it can be very powerful because it allows you to justify a great many things that you might not under normal conditions. And I worry that there's some element of this happening with the race, that a lot of the ways in which AI has been framed, including by the tech sector, has taken this from a normal policy issue to one where the future of the United States is at stake, and therefore all the other considerations that would normally come into play, whether it's thinking about like how you scale up energy while being environmentally friendly, or how you do kind of democratic oversight around development, all those can need to be kind of set aside a little bit because there is this fundamental kind of threat to the future of the United States, and above all else, we need to sort of win the race or stay ahead of our opponents or so on. And I mean, I think that is both a relevant and quite a powerful concept, and I think there's some clear evidence that this is being employed. And it's interesting that like some of the lobbying bodies like American Edge in the US like very clearly lean into this, and they they talk a bit about kind of the positives of AI, but a lot of the messaging is around this looming kind of terrifying threat of China getting ahead of the US and completely sort of dominating the future of the US, which again, my impression is that's not really how they're thinking about it. But if you're a member of the public, or if you're a policymaker and you're hearing this from a lot of different sources, and it can feel like an organic independent thing, but actually American Edge, um they don't reveal who their funders are at present, but somebody traced back that they got a very large amount of funding from Meta back in 2021, and it may very well be that Meta continues to be their funders. So, you're getting kind of Newsweek articles and, Fox News interviews and um, y- evidence submissions for the action plan, lots and lots of different sources telling you that there's a giant, giant looming threat and that you need to take all these actions, putting aside the normal kind of niceties like, well, people's copyright protection or environmental laws or whatever else it might be, because, in an emergency situation, you just do what needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. What's your kind of, what do you think is likely to happen in future? I mean, this is kind of a hard question, so I'm happy for you to kind of like rearrange the question if you would rather. But what do you think is the most like likely scenario as you see it currently, if we kind of continue on our current path, let's say? And what would be like a best case scenario for you?
So, I mean, that's a very hard question to answer. I think that one of the answers might. So, one way to answer this is to ask what happens in the science. And the way I see it, we the future branches in two possible directions. I mean, many possible directions, but two broad buckets. One is that it becomes more clear that AI is, what we might consider a normal technology, like, very transformative, but more along the lines of the internet or electricity, in which case, exporting technology and getting countries to adopt it and competing in individual domains rather than necessarily competing over the kind of you know best overall model makes more sense. Um, one possible future is that we go down that way, and in some ways that feels less worrying to me because it just looks like the world we have at the moment, except with better technology and so on, and the kinds of worries we have at the moment, except a little bit kind of accelerated or amplified. Then there's another world where the idea of AGI really is looming and imminent, and it becomes clear that we're going to develop something that really is going to upend civilization in coming years, and where whoever develops it first really does have a huge kind of geopolitical impact. And in some ways, that's a much more worrying situation because, one, I think we need to be very, very careful in how we develop such a technology. And I think the worst possible situation is a situation in which an actual race emerge between, for example, the US and China, or the US and any other country, or in fact, even like two companies in the US. I think if companies are racing towards this instead of going slowly and taking care about kind of fundamental alignment issues, that could be very concerning. And I think that it has to become, I don't know, it seems realistic to me that it's going to become clearer over the next couple of years which of these worlds we're in, because it's going to be harder and harder to justify putting absolutely huge investments into air research and data center build out and um, basically kind of development models that are never quite in profit when you consider the investment that's going on. Unless it's very, very clear that something very big is coming down the line, there's going to have to be a different model. So it feels like this has to bifurcate at some point. So that's, I guess, a way of approaching this question, thinking about the science of it. Then we can kind of think about the politics and governance of it. And I think a little bit more about the world in which AGI is plausible, because I think it's a world where if we get it wrong, it's most worrying. And within that world, there's a future in which we achieve the level of dialogue between the US and China where we recognize that competition is fine in a whole load of different areas, but on some key issues we do need cooperation. For example, red lines on safety. For example, being really careful about initiating recursive self-improvement, so having systems that sort of improve upon themselves in an accelerated fashion. And my hope is we get to the point where ideally we have those kind of red lines in place, while allowing competition in other domains and some sort of mechanism where the rest of the world gets to say as well. I mean, I'm here in the UK, as are you. I would ideally like a future in which AI wasn't just done to us by the leading two nations, but where there was some sort of global democratic conversation around it. I guess the other world in the AGI one is one where the development of AGI is very much within a geopolitical race where the leading nations both feel under huge threat from the other if the other gets there first. And then it feels to me like a roll of the dice. Hopefully it goes well both on the technological side and on the governance side, but it does feel to me like a very, very high risk scenario, and I would love for us to avoid that if it's at all possible.
Same. Um, is there anything that people listening, or kind of, I guess, people that are interested in this area? I mean, you kind of already talked about it to some degree. But is there anything that they could do you think, to try to make it go well? Like, are there some key things that you think are useful You've kind of already talked to them about them a little bit, but yeah.
Well, I think I've mainly talked to them. I guess it depends on the different areas people are in. So I think the first is don't always take the more extreme race narratives at face value. I mean, there have been claims that the US has to initiate a Manhattan Project because China's racing to AGI, and those have been made by like senior kind of government advisors. Still, I think, turn out to not really be true. So do question them. Do recognize that there are vested interests involved in this, and that is not to say that everybody's lying about this stuff. I'm not making that claim, but I think people can end up convincing themselves of an idea or talking, to the same echo chamber around an idea and getting a little bit disconnected from what's actually happening over there and so on. So, I would recommend taking these things with a grain of salt. I would say that if you're an academic working in kind of AI or AI governance, or even more broadly, if you have opportunities to do kind of collaborative engagement across some of these divides, it can be of a lot of value because as we enter this future, the more sort the more links and more opportunities we have to just kind of talk to the human beings on the other side of this thing and recognize that we broadly care about the same things. I think the better. I mean, hopefully there will always be some, well, I mean, there might not always be, but at least for the time being, there will be, competitive issues and there will be points of tension and there will be points of conflict. But that doesn't mean that we can't make things a little bit better by finding the points of common ground during all these times. There are a number of directions that I think are interesting. Um, there's a lot of interesting work happening around things like verification. It's one thing just to sort of form agreements, but if we can monitor and verify and really be able to definitively tell that, our different governments or different labs are um, sticking to agreements, I think it makes it a lot easier to cooperate, trust but verify, as they say. Uh, I hope generally kind of any sort of transparency requirements that come in at national or international level at least allow us to have a better sense of what's going on in leading facilities, which are predominantly leading companies these days. I mean, it's going to be really important for us to know what the actual frontier is, which may or may not be the models that are out in the world. It might be models that are under development or being used internally. The more policymakers and governance scholars actually know what the actual frontier is, the better we are positioned to engage with it, both in terms of responding to it nationally and figuring out how to navigate the international landscape. And I guess there's all sorts of work to be done around, what can we cooperate on even in the face of competition? There's so many things that even while there's competition or some degree of disagreement going on, it makes sense to cooperate on. You know, um, you don't want models that can be subject to adversarial attack by, I know, non-state actors or co-opted for misuse. The US, UK, and China all have a whole lot of digital and physical infrastructure they want to protect, and so it's in our interests that the asymmetry of that means working together on hardening some elements of that or making the models less easy to jailbreak seems like it benefits everyone. So trying to figure out where it is that cooperation is beneficial, even when there is competition and some degree of adversarialness going on, I think is very valuable.
That's really interesting. Could you say a tiny bit more about the work on verifying, like that labs are sticking to what they've said? Because I haven't actually come across that.
There was a very long and detailed and quite excellent report that came out from the Oxford Martin AI Governance Initiative last summer, I believe. So I think Ben Harrick and Robert Traeger would have been authors of that on that, alongside others. And that really would be, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, and I'm on the spot here, so forgive me if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, that would be the go-to I would recommend, and that's 80 pages. And there have been other proposals like and there's a proposal called FlexHegs that's really kind of hardware level governance that David Dalrymple and Nora Mann and others have been working on. And I think that proposal is hosted by on Yoshua Bengio's website at the moment. And that's really looking at, how do you sort of embed agreements in the hardware so that the ships only really work if you're doing the thing you said you were going to do. And that could be, making sure the ships are being used for inference but not for training. You could put in like, geolocation so that you know where the chips are going and so they are where they're supposed to be. There are a lot of things that you could do so that what's actually being done with the fundamental hardware that AI is being developed on. And that then, yeah, my hope is that we can develop a toolkit that means that, when we come up with agreements, we have ways of assuring everyone that everybody is standing by those agreements. And I guess one thing that maybe we're a little bit lucky with AI is that, and perhaps this will change, perhaps it is changing, I'm not so sure, but at least for the very leading models we've had, they have been quite big endeavors. It's required a lot of money, a lot of hardware, a lot of energy. And so it's been at least possible to track them rather than just kind of have a secret project. Now, some of the recent models have had very good performance at, with more limited energy and hardware requirements, but it's at least not the kind of endeavor where three people in a basement can develop the super intelligence, at least at the time being. So there are some advantages that I think we have.